you asked about favorite stories, and this doesn't exactly relate to the ranch per se, but in the early years that my father was on the ranch, it was in the winter time, and he was riding from the lower ranch out to the gooseberry side, and he looked down in this field that was kind of off down below him, and he could see this pile of hay moving, and he couldn't figure out how can this be? Because all he could see was this pile of hay moving across this field. And he watched, and finally he realized that it was somebody under that pile of hay moving it. And when Mervin and I and Mervin's sisters were young, there was a lady that lived on the Wood River by herself with her herd of goats. And she would go over to the loose haystacks on the Antlers Ranch and essentially steal hay. And she had this method where she would bind a pile of hay together with rope, and then she would get under it and kind of,
Goodness.
and that was how she fed her goats, and she helped herself to those haystacks and moved them a little bit at a time to her goat herd.
Yeah, she raised goats, and after she passed away, the goats went feral and lived between Wood River and Gooseberry Creek up in the rims, and they were there for years.
Yes.
And I think the coyotes and predators and stuff finally wiped them out.
Yeah. And she was pretty handy with the wire nippers, and she would cut the fence so the goats could roam wide, because she just had a little, well, she had 160 acres that I think, but she didn't have any way. There was a little hay meadow there, but she didn't have any way to harvest it or anything, so she just took advantage of the neighbor's hay.
Her husband was a surveyor. He was well educated, and I'm sure he surveyed a lot of the country around the lower Wood River.
His name was George Hurlbut, and her name was Carrie Hurlbut. And she was my mother's first grade teacher. And her name was Carrie Belle Hurlbut when she first came here. And then she married George Hurlbut. And he died about 1926 or so. And so she lived as a single woman from that time on. And she apparently didn't have the best mental health as time went on.
And she lived into the 50s at least.
Well, into the early 60s, I think. I think that they finally determined that she needed full-time care and took her away to Evanston in the early 60s or something. Because she lived in the cabin with her goats.
The goats and cats, I understand.
Her cabin was a 2-room cabin, and she and the goats lived in one room, and she had a collection of books and magazines and letters and all of that sort of thing that she kept in the other room.
So what is the story of the fondly remembered goat lady? Carrie Hurlbut was born Carrie Stump to Jason and Belle Stump in West Virginia. In July 1905, Carrie came to Wyoming from where she was living with her aunt and uncle in Bismarck, North Dakota. She was on a trip to visit her sister Elizabeth, who had married Reverend Gould. Carrie planned to take a trip with the family to Yellowstone National Park before returning to North Dakota, where she would resume teaching school. Her plans changed, and in August 1905, it is announced that Carrie would be teaching at the school in Otto. Over her time, she would teach at Fenton, Burlington, Grable, Osborne, and Sunshine schools. In her obituary, it is stated that Mrs. Hurlbut won recognition as one of the best teachers of her day. While at the Sunshine School, or possibly through mutual friends, Carrie met local rancher and surveyor George Washington Hurlbut, and the couple was married on July 9, 1920. They settled on George's ranch on the Wood River. Although George was 57 and Carrie was 34, it was a first marriage for both of them. Unfortunately, George would pass away almost 6 years after their marriage of cancer, leaving Carrie on the holdings alone. It seems that Carrie waited until the 1940s to add goats to her small holding. We have a copy of the purebred certificate of registry for Nikolai, a white hornless billy goat that was bought by Carrie in 1948. You'll notice in some of the photos, however, that some goats do in fact have horns. When Carrie left in 1958, her goats roamed the hills until the predators got them, but the memories of the Wood River goats carries on.